Welcome everyone to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and as part of today's podcast, I want to talk about how the podcast was inspired. So, with that being said, I'll talk about my personal story of emotional grit and ways that things helped me along the whole process that could also help you with whatever you're going through. So, back in 2016, I got the surprising diagnosis of a brain tumor. And I say surprising because I never even had a headache that I was even aware of. No cognitive problems, no speech impediments, nothing. Literally, my eye doctor had acted on a hunch at an eye appointment to get my contact prescription renewed. Apparently, my peripheral vision wasn't quite what it used to be, even though I still have peripheral vision. So I'm very grateful that she acted on a hunch and had me go to a specialist. The specialist then ran more tests and took pictures of the backs of my eyes. He then said, Jennifer, I'm acting on a hunch, same as my other eye doctor, and said, I want you to have an MRI. I think something might be pushing on your optic nerve. And of course, the day after the MRI, that's when I got the news of the brain tumor. And the thing about it is that not only was I surprised, but I was also in denial. I mean, for the first few minutes as I was talking to the doctor, it was almost like we were talking about a third party. Again, because I didn't have any symptoms that I could feel. But then as soon as I got off the phone with him, the emotion hit me. And I literally curled up in a ball on my bedroom floor and began sobbing. And I was so convinced in that moment that my world was coming down. I mean, just right in front of me in a matter of seconds. So as I laid there sobbing, I thought to myself, you know what? I can't let this consume me. So I literally got out a pad of paper and a pen, and I actually made a list of reasons why it's positive to have a brain tumor, which sounds super counterintuitive, but it was almost like my world was out of control. And by having that mindset of gratitude, I felt a sense of control and a voice in my experience. So with this list that I made, it starts out with something to the effect of, maybe I'll lose some weight. Maybe I'll meet a hot single doctor. And then it gets a little bit more somber as I wrote such things as good reminder to count blessings and good excuse to reach out to people I haven't seen in a while. And then my list got a little bit too somber for me, so I ended it with good excuse to eat dessert first. Well, I later learned there's actually science behind the way that I felt because having a mindset of gratitude, not just happiness, but gratitude, can actually lower your stress hormones and influence the feel good chemicals of the brain, such as dopamine, serotonin, or endorphins. And gratitude isn't alone in that effort. As a matter of fact, pets can have the same effect if you're open to the idea of pets. I know if you travel for work a fair amount, like I do, you can see at airports around the country, whether it's San Francisco, Colorado, Minneapolis, New Orleans, all over the place, volunteers come to the airports with their pets. And the thought is that by having their pet available for strangers to pet between flights, they again can help people smile on the inside and lower those stress hormones. Now, to those of you who aren't pet people, that might sound a little bit crazy, but I can tell you there's a reason why VA hospitals use pets for people with PTSD. Again, it's the lowering of those stress hormones. I also know that there are libraries in the Minneapolis area here in Minnesota. That's where I live. There are libraries who want to actually increase literacy levels of kids, specifically little kids who are shy or those who perhaps have like a speech impediment. Perhaps they might lisp or stutter. They'll go to the library thinking, I want to read to the dog or I want to read to the rabbit. Because at school, kids might laugh at them, but obviously the pet's not going to do that. So these libraries help actually promote literacy with these kids because they want to go there and read to the pets. Also, there are courthouses around the country, anywhere from California to Montana, Minnesota, Michigan, other states as well, where volunteers bring their pets to the courthouses for people who are afraid to testify. So whether it's vulnerable adults or little kids, they're brought to testify once those stress hormones go down because of the pets. So pretty cool stuff. Also, I can't speak highly enough about laughter. I mean, people will say that laughter is the best medicine, and I'd heard that since I was a little kid, but I didn't actually appreciate it until I had my experience with the surgery. Now, I should also add that my tumor was discovered right here. I literally have a metal plate now where the surgeon went in to address my tumor. Because my tumor is so close to the carotid artery, I'm very grateful that my surgeon had the wisdom to remove half and leave half of it behind. Now, the remaining half got radiation treatments, even though it wasn't cancerous. And so, throughout the healing process from the surgery, and of course, having these radiation treatments, and then healing after that as well, pets, laughter, and gratitude played huge roles. And in addition to that, I can't speak highly enough about acts of kindness. I know that friends and family, or colleagues for that matter, would bring either desserts or some kind of an entree to my house for me to eat. And of course, I was incredibly happy to get those items, but they were also happy to bring them to me. They would literally be excited, like, "What? I made you some cookies," or "I can't wait to have you eat my new spaghetti sauce," or whatever it was. Well, I later learned that when with acts of kindness, that they can actually initiate what's called a helper's high. It's a serotonin rush in your head. And that's why if you say give your seat to a stranger on a bus, or say you're hypothetically in a line to pay for coffee at Starbucks, but you anonymously pay for the person behind you and walk away, again, you can get that helper's high for doing something nice. I know when I was traveling in California for work a few years ago, I learned about a couple there who own a donut shop. And literally, they would bake their donuts every day and then sell them together as a couple. Well, it turns out that the wife had some kind of a health condition that warranted being in the hospital for weeks. Well, the husband, of course, wanted to go visit his wife, but couldn't really do that because he had to sell the donuts to then pay for the hospital bills and take care of things at home as well. Well, somehow word got out in their community because strangers would literally go to their donut shop and not just buy one donut. They would perhaps instead buy six donuts, or maybe buy a dozen donuts for that matter, knowing that if that inventory was gone, say by mid morning, the gentleman who owned the store could go visit his wife then in the hospital. So, of course, the wife benefited, the husband benefited, the people who actually bought the extra donuts benefited as well. And now those of us who have either just heard about the story or read about it online can benefit from hearing that too. Pretty cool stuff. I also know that there are studies that show that any kind of an act of altruism, like for example, there was one study where people gave blood and they were told they were giving blood for earthquake victims. Those people who gave the blood later reported that the needle hurt less because they felt good for doing it for the earthquake victims. Well, again, if you can have that serotonin rush, it's interesting how that can actually affect your pain perception. So amazing, amazing stuff that could help with job stress as well. So I tell people as I do my public speaking, if a bad day at work happens, or perhaps you're fighting with your spouse, or maybe you're feeling isolated because you're working from home and you're not used to being by yourself all the time, my challenge for people is again, pay for someone else's coffee anonymously. Or I've heard of stories of people who go through drive-throughs at restaurants and they'll get to the cashier window to pay, only to find out the car ahead of them paid for their food. And they then get inspired to pay for the car behind them. Same thing at toll roads. People pay for tolls for the cars behind them. Now, that's not at first that's not going to change how things happen for you at your office or at your home, wherever the actual stress is. But it could put a spring in your step and make a difference in how you perceive those items, because perspective is half the battle. I would say the crown jewel, though, in my personal experience with emotional grit, was how music affected me in my personal situation. Every time I went to the hospital to have my radiation treatments done, I listened to music on my smartphone that was playing then through speakers at the hospital. But the key thing is that one person's good music is somebody else's noise. And in my case, I like old school hip hop. I also like hair bands, from back in the 1980s. So music is very subjective. And that's why I encourage people to, especially at hospitals, don't just ask someone what's your favorite kind of music. Actually ask who are your favorite performers or what are your favorite songs. Because for me, just because I like hip hop doesn't mean that I like all hip hop music. It's very, very subjective. I know in June of this year, I spoke at a neurology conference in Hamburg, Germany, about the science in the book that I wrote. And as you can see behind me, I have notations here for the actual title of the book. And it was interesting how the book, which is in tandem with my podcast about the things that I'm talking about, made an impact on the people overseas, whether it was people in the medical community or again, maybe they were students and being stressed out from studying and things like that. Doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. We're all wired with those stress hormones and trying to reduce them. Now, as far as my book goes, you might wonder, like, well, what does the title mean? The actual title is Greater Than. Remember in math class, the old greater than and less than sign? So greater than is that greater than sign. So it's greater than the power and strength of emotional grit. And the reason why I came up with the title Greater Than is because a few weeks after my radiation treatments ended, I had an opportunity to get on stage at my church to share my story and just kind of how I got through everything. And I thought to myself, okay, well, the sanctuary seats about 1,000 people. And I was going to be speaking at about four services. So that's like 4,000 people. And until that time, I bet you I hadn't spoken in front of maybe 60 or 70. So it was a bit of an adjustment. And a number of people would ask me, well, Jennifer, if you're not used to speaking in front of 1,000 people at a time, aren't you going to be nervous to do that? And I would say, well, yeah. And then they look at me kind of funny and say, well, then how are you going to do it? And that's where my greater than came into play. Because I would say my desire to help others is greater than my fear of the stage. Doesn't mean I can't be afraid. It just means I'm going to do it anyway. And that became a metaphor for life. That obviously I made an effect on me, but could also make an effect on you and your circumstance as well. In the actual book, there are different people who I interviewed and different people who I wrote about who I would also love to have on the podcast. So stay tuned for future episodes. I know one person I interviewed was a firefighter who served at 9/11, or excuse me, served at Ground Zero on 9/11. And for him, his greater than was that his sense of duty or his desire to help others was greater than his willingness to protect himself. I also wrote about a concert violinist here in Minnesota who plays the violin for a living, but he noticed he began having hand tremors. And so he thought, well, man, I can't pursue my passion or do my job for that matter, having my hands shake. So he went down to the Mayo Clinic and they said they would do surgery on him. So literally he would be awake during his craniotomy, which to me is mind-boggling as it is. But it would be very helpful if during the surgery he played his violin. So that's exactly what he did. And by playing his violin, as a surgical team, dug around in his head, they could actually tell when they put different electrodes in there how that affected the shaky part of his tremors, and they helped them actually remedy the issue. And now he can play his violin. So with his greater than, it would be his desire to pursue his passion needed to be greater than his fear of the surgery. It's a pretty cool thing. And it's interesting too, just kind of how we're more capable of things than we even imagine. That being said, another real important part of the podcast, and for future episodes as well, is what I call just kind of a mindset of emotional grit, kind of a hearty, when you can't not experience something, it's possible to figure out the how kind of a mindset. And it's interesting how if you can kind of work on the little things in everyday life, collectively, then you have the confidence when huge things happen that you didn't see coming, which in my case, of course, was the brain tumor. I know an example of this would be back when I was in college. So I did my undergraduate degree up in northern Minnesota, up by Lake Superior, which, as you can imagine, has very cold winters. And my sophomore year, I was running late for class and I could not find my mittens anywhere. And I thought, oh, I've got to find my mittens and I've got to get to school. So I thought, okay, what's my contingency plan? So without missing a beat, I put socks on my hands. And then I went outside and I realized my car doors were frozen shut. And I thought, oh, I'm like, I've got to get to class. So I went around to the back of the car and somehow I jimmied open the hatchback. I crawled over the spare tire wearing the socks on my hands and I drove to school. Well, when I got to class, I was showing people the socks on my hands and people were laughing. But there was one guy in particular who sat back in his chair and he put his arm on it and he goes, oh, Jennifer, that's nothing. And I said, oh, really? He goes, yeah, see that guy over there? And I was like, yeah. He goes, he'd actually walked to school in this weather today and he couldn't find his mittens. So he wore oven mitts. I thought, did I just get upstaged by oven mitts? But it made me realize that for people who aren't used to a cold climate, they might think, wow, to live in a climate where there's weather that's cold enough to warrant socks on the hands and oven mitts and having to actually force open your hatchback because your doors are frozen shut, what a daunting way to start the week. But to us, it was just Monday because we were used to it. Because when you can't not experience the cold, you learn to figure out the how. And again, that became a way of life, and that kind of a hearty mindset carried over into other areas. So it's like I could actually build confidence as I went along. So that kind of stuff can actually help in everyday life as well. Again, regardless of what kind of stress it is with whatever you're experiencing in life. So as the podcast progresses with different episodes, I also want to ask, what are your examples of greater thans in your personal life? So perhaps maybe one of you or many of you are going through a divorce and your love for your children has to be greater than your disdain for your ex. And that's why if your child has a choir concert or a hockey game or something to that effect, you still want to go support your child, even though your ex is going to be there and it makes you kind of feel uncomfortable because your love for your child is greater than your disdain for your ex. Or perhaps you're a student and maybe there's like a super big party going on at campus and you're super excited you want to go, but you realize the next day is a test and you don't quite feel prepared for it. That's where discipline comes into play and drive, because your desire to do well on the test and sit at the table and study needs to be greater than your willingness or desire to go to the party. So it's interesting how, and again, in everyday life, those kinds of scenarios can come up regardless of who you are. In addition to that, people oftentimes don't think about caregivers. I know for me, with my medical scenario, people, of course, would think about patients, whether it was someone like me who had surgery for a brain tumor, or perhaps someone who got brain damage from a car accident or something like that. Either way, you can't see on the outside that anything is wrong. But on the inside, the person either has a tumor or had a tumor or has the brain damage. But either way, people feel sorry for the patient or survivors of that kind of thing. But what about the caregivers? So on the home front, you could have caregiving scenarios where perhaps it's one spouse taking care of another, or it could be a spouse taking care of their child and their parent. I know there's a term called the sandwich generation, where it's someone taking care of one or more of their of kids, coupled with the responsibilities of taking care of their parents as well. Or it could be a child taking care of their sibling. I mean, there are a lot of scenarios in the home front that involve caregiving, where the caregiver can actually get what's called compassion fatigue. I mean, literally, it's where the person feels guilty because they'll think, oh, you know what? I love this person and should want to help, but they just feel drained. So, because they themselves are falling off their own priority list. There are also caregivers who do caregiving for a living. And I think a lot of people assume that because someone's wearing a white lab coat, whether it's a doctor or perhaps a dentist, even a veterinarian, or perhaps a clergy member, who's wearing either a suit or some kind of a collar, people think that because they're in positions of authority and they're there to help everybody else, that they must be this pillar of strength. But in reality, they're humans just like us, and they have needs as well. So that's kind of where the idea of the greater than can get kind of tricky, because based on their professions or people in their personal life who have these caregiving responsibilities want to help others, but they themselves have to be on their priority list too, or else after a while, things just don't bode well for anybody. So I know that I've obviously shared a lot today, but I'm very excited for this podcast series. I want to make sure that the things that I've learned can apply, which I've noticed when I interview people for my book and when I do my public speaking as well. But I also want to hear from you. So feel free to go to my YouTube site. If you go into YouTube and put in either Emotional Grit or put in Jennifer Fernjack, my channel will come up, and feel free to subscribe to the podcast series. I also have a website that's jenniferfernjack.com. And it has on there different examples of things I've done and things that I'm doing, both with the book and with my public speaking world as well. And then on top of that, if you have a story you want to share, again, feel free to contact me on my website, and I would love to hear from you. So I also want to end today's episode with a quote. The quote is from famed author Henry David Thoreau. And he had said, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see." A reminder about perspective. A good chunk of life is about just not what you experience, but how you view it, and how you can actually be either your own worst enemy in that regard, or you can actually take the things that I've shared today along with future episodes to help you along the way and have a sense of hope. So thank you for joining me, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.